Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Tanner Lectures on Human Values. I want to give you a little background about the lectures. The Tanner Lectures were established at Cambridge University in 1978. They are annual celebrations of academic and intellectual excellence, enlivening campus communities at 9 universities in the U.S. and abroad. Harvard is proud to be among them, and prouder still to host outstanding scholars whose work enriches all of our lives. Humble beginnings in 1904 paved the way for our gathering today. Let me tell you a little bit about the namesake. Obert Clark Tanner, who established these lectures, started at the bottom, literally. He was the youngest of 10 children, and he got his start as an entrepreneur making class rings in his mother's basement. There was, as they say, nowhere to go but up. And up he went. The O.C. Tanner Company became a leading manufacturer of employee recognition awards for exceptional talent, and Mr. Tanner went on to enjoy, as he liked to put it, a life full of adventure and variety. That adventure and variety included higher education in general, and the University of Utah in particular. Mr. Tanner taught philosophy there for decades. To say that this experience inspired ardent affection would be a bit of an understatement. The university, he asserted, is absolutely the greatest creation of human existence. I wish we could hear those words more often. It has the greatest promise, the greatest help, the greatest meaning for finding what is true and what is valuable. Emboldened by the prospect of understanding and improving the human condition, he generously supported the arts and arts making and the humanities through his philanthropy. He thought of these lectures as, and here I quote, a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. This understanding may be pursued for its own intrinsic worth, but it may also eventually have practical consequences for the quality of personal and social life. There is an inspiring openness and faith in the power of learning in Mr. Tanner's ambition. He understood that the pursuit of knowledge must proceed without restriction, advancing from a place of curiosity and possibility. This commitment to academic freedom and the free exchange of ideas is essential to the fulfillment of our mission. We strive to be as great as the university that loomed large in his imagination and that inspired his trust and support, the greatest creation of human existence. We will hear the first lecture this afternoon. A second lecture will take place in this room tomorrow at the same time. On Friday, there will be a seminar with our distinguished guests in the San Paulo room of the Talbot Building at noon. Many thanks to the Harvard Tanner Faculty Committee for appointing today's lecturer, and to the team at the Mahindra Humanities Center for planning today's event. I am especially grateful to Professor Bruno Carvalho for his service and leadership as interim director of the center. Thank you, Bruno. Now over to you for the introductions.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Tanner Lectures. So I am interim director of Mahindra while Susie Clark is on leave. And the and interim in Latin comes from between. I am very aware that I currently stand between you and who you came here to see, so I will be brief. Thank you to President Alan Garber for that wonderful introduction, and to the Office of the President, as well as our team at Mahindra, and I will name them for all the work towards this event. Steve Beal, Julia Corso, Mary McKinnon, Charlotte Whitman, Lisa Brown, Gerta Uruzzi Limani. I'll also name the Tanner Lecture and thank them for a very wise decision. Professors Susanna Clark, Nian Hershey, Gina Kim, Shigehisa Kuriyama, Kenneth Mack, Martha Minow, Robert Reed Farr, Charles Marshall Stang. And thank you all for being here. So in my capacity directing a university-wide center that hosts a range of events, I've learned it's not always the case that I have something substantial to say about a distinguished guest's work. Having read an early draft of the talk you were all about to hear, I know that, like me, you will each respond with your own substantial questions and examples to Professor Hahn's arguments. And that's a testament both to the expansive scope and probing depth of her thought, as well as its ability to communicate with a sense of generosity and adventure. Her writing does much of what it calls for in democracy. It invites us in, regardless of our professional fields or personal beliefs. And as an urbanite scarred by too many experiences with obstructionist, quote-unquote, NIMBYism, capturing, quote-unquote, participatory planning, I was heartened and won over by her defense of power sharing and embrace of uncertainty of outcome. And as a scholar of the history of urbanization, schooled in the very basic lesson that in the history of urban planning, the unplanned happens almost as a rule, I was inspired by her articulation of adjacent possibilities. But let's avoid spoilers. I'm assuming that, like me, you will each be eager to hear more from Professor Hahn. So please remember, as President Garber mentioned, that we're back here again tomorrow, when Eric Bierbaum will introduce and Doran Schrantz will respond, and then for a lunch discussion with Liz McKenna on Friday, just down the road at the Bloomberg Center for Cities. You can find more details online. And you can also, if you haven't yet, read her work. Professor Hahn's writings often draw as much on stories as statistics. Her books include Moved to Action, Motivation, Participation, and Inequality in American Politics, Groundbreakers, How Obama's 2.2 million volunteers transformed campaigning in America, How Organizations Develop Activists, Civic Associations, and Leadership in the 21st Century, and with Liz McKenna and Michelle Okayawa, Prisms of the People, Prisms of the People, Power and Organizing in 21st Century America. Professor Hahn is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Professor of Political Science, and faculty director of the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins University. And after Professor Hahn's lecture, we will be fortunate to welcome Professor Daniel Allen to offer remarks. And the question isn't whether it's necessary to introduce Professor Allen, but whether it's possible, given her many accolades, publications, and judicious work on behalf of democracy. Her books in this eventful but short decade alone include Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus and Justice by Means of Democracy. She's a former chair of the Mellon Foundation and Pulitzer Prize boards and writes a column for the Washington Post. Here at Harvard, she's the James Bryant Conant University Professor and Director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Thank you both for being here. Please join me in a warm welcome.
Good afternoon. It's really lovely to see all of you here today. Let me start just by thanking President Garber and Professor Carvalho for the generous introductions, to the Tanner Committee for inviting me here today and for hosting me, and then also Danielle Allen and Doran Schrantz for being willing to be in dialogue with me today and tomorrow. And of course, all of you for showing up today. It's really wonderful to see you all. I think it goes without saying what a great honor it is to be invited to deliver these Tanner lectures. I've been trying to find a way to express how humbled and surprised I was by the invitation, but I didn't feel like I could quite figure out the right way to do so. And so, as one does in 2024, I decided to ask ChatGPT what I should say. And so I went to ChatGPT and I said, can you give me like a pithy and witty way to say how humbled I am by this invitation? And this is what came back. I feel like a stray dog at a pedigree dog show up here, but hey, let's see if I can do a trick or two. So some of you might be disappointed I wasn't planning to do any tricks, and so I thought I'd try one more time, and it came back with, being asked to speak here is like being named 8th grade class president, even though my campaign promises were as empty as my backpack. Okay, so perhaps it's just sufficient to say that I really am honored to be here, and I hope you'll take my word that that's the only part of the speech that ChatGPT wrote. So ChatGPT aside, I have to admit that actually in this moment of precarity around the world, preparing for this lectures have unexpectedly been kind of like a balm to my soul, because it offered me the rare opportunity to return to first principles, to interrogate and take stock of the questions that really animate my work and why I do the work that I do. I actually first became interested in politics when I was an undergraduate here at Harvard, and I stumbled unwittingly into student activism and had for the first time an experience of what it felt like to be a person acting with dignity in the public sphere. The effort that I was working on did involve some protesting against the Harvard administration, so I'm not unaware of the irony of being back here today to deliver these lectures. But rest assured, and probably luckily for Harvard, the effort failed to achieve its objectives. But in some ways, that didn't actually matter. It didn't matter because at the time what I learned was that victory or loss was incidental to the experience of identifying a problem, learning to strategize with my peers about how to solve it, and then putting our whole hearts into trying to co-create the world that we wanted. It was intoxicating enough that after college, I went to DC to work in politics, and a few years after that to graduate school to study it. And one way to characterize my career is the quest to understand what made those experiences of collective action so magically intoxicating, and to learn how to recreate them for as many people as possible. So the core question that I wanted to take up today in these two lectures really concerns the mechanics and the meaning of collective action in democracy, trying to understand how does collective action work and why does it matter for democracy? And relatedly, what might that tell us about this moment of democratic dysfunction that we have around the world? So I want to first say 3 things about the approach that I'm going to take over the next couple days to unpacking these ideas. First, I want to try telling you stories about collective action and democracy that illuminate what I think are some of their core mechanics. And by choosing to tell stories instead of sharing a lot of data or offering a purely conceptual argument, I don't mean to sidestep the robust scholarly debates that are going on around these questions. Instead, I'm choosing to tell stories because I want not only to capture a cognitive sense of what collective action is and how it works, but also to evoke an emotional one. We live in a world in which we try to use numbers and computers to boil down human experience down to a repeatable set of numbers, pixels, or bits of code that can recreate virtual replicas of everything from our friends to our office spaces. But what if the point of some aspects of democratic life, indeed of the human experience, is not just to replicate the outcome, but to actually have the experience itself? Put another way, part of what makes collective action so central to democracy is not its predictable effect on outcomes or the actions that can be replicated thousands of times, but instead, I will argue that the meaning of collective action emerges in part from its unpredictability and the emotional and cognitive and strategic risks that it demands that people take. Collective action makes democracy work in part because it generates a necessary brew of cognitive and emotional possibility and constraint that sometimes is better captured through stories than sterile conceptual definitions. Second, it's also worth noting the stories I tell won't necessarily describe the modal or average experience that most people have of American democracy. So why share them if they're describing outliers? The stories hopefully will stretch the horizons of what we believe to be possible in American democracy and help us explore what the complexity scientist Stuart Kauffman calls the adjacent possible, or the shadow futures that hover on the edges of our present reality. As many have argued, democracy depends on experimentation, and experimentation often begins by peering into these adjacent possibilities. So we constantly have to be learning from the world around us. And so for those in the audience who are dismayed that I'm mostly going to be telling you stories, let me just explain this part of the task in more quantitative terms. In many studies of collective action, the task often is to explain why people get involved. Yet, if you look at the dominant models of participation that we have out there, our ability to explain people's involvement still leaves a lot of room for explanation. That's all the white stuff on the top of the graph. This graph just shows the adjusted R-squared from dominant models of participation. And as social scientists, we spend a great deal of our time trying to explain what we would call B hat, right? Trying to explain the coefficient that specifies the relationship between predictors X and the outcome Y. But what if we were try instead to explain the unexplained space, right? What one might think of as kind of the dark matter of participation. And there we can focus instead on what remains unexplained about Y hat. And so that is why we want to look to the outliers of the adjacent possible instead of looking just to the modal experience that people have, because that's how we can try to identify what it is that our existing models don't, in fact, capture. So throughout these lectures, I'm going to be drawing on research that I've been doing with people that are organizing in Christian faith communities across America, particularly within some white evangelical communities. And so given the headlines that we see about white evangelicals these days, such communities likely represent what most people in this room wouldn't necessarily think of as a place where democracy is being realized. But as I hope to show, they are also places where multiracial groups of people are fighting for a vision of the world that they seek. These commitments drive them to ask questions about things like collaboration, community, negotiation, compromise, pluralism, meaning, leadership, and power. And many of these people do not have an obvious political home in America because they're alienated from the Republicans because of their yearning for justice, and alienated from the Democrats because of their commitment to faith. But their experiences offer glimpses into what could be, into the adjacent possible, that give us an example of what it looks like to nurture and express people's dignity and then put that relationship into action. Third and finally, the questions and arguments that I take up here today are relevant, I hope, not only for the scholarly audience in the room, but also for the world of organizers, practitioners, philanthropists, leaders, and supporters of collective action that I've been privileged to work with over the many years. Sometimes in the academy, I think we create what is a false distinction between work that is relevant for practitioners and work that is relevant for scholars. And it took me over a decade to figure out how to do academic work in a way that bridges practice, meets the twin goals of both relevance and rigor. But once I figured a version of it out, I have found that the knottiest strategic questions that practitioners are grappling with often overlap or even push the boundaries of thought among academics. And so organizers might use different language than scholars to describe the strategic questions that keep them up at night. But when we can build the conceptual bridges between the two conversations, then I think both are richer as a result. So with that, let's turn back to the mechanics and meaning of collective action and democracy. How does collective action work, and what do these lessons teach us about democracy, particularly as it relates to this moment of democratic dysfunction around the world? The point that collective action is foundational to making democracy work is not novel. Over the course of these two lectures, however, I want to argue that not all forms of collective action are the same when it comes to their relationship to democracy, and that part of what we've lost in 21st century America is a particular form of collective action that teaches people the commitments and capabilities for power sharing that are necessary in a pluralistic democracy. To illustrate these distinctions between different forms of collective action and their impact, I want to focus on three core aspects of collective action: how people acting together become something new, how people belong to each other, and then what it takes to build something at scale. So becoming, belonging, building. Putting the pieces together, I'm going to argue that revitalizing democracy will depend on rethinking the opportunities that we create for how we bring people together. So in today's lecture, I want to start by illustrating the way that forms of collective action can differ from each other and explore possibilities that can be created if we look to the alternate possibilities, when people become something new, when they're offered the opportunity to act together, and what that looks like. And then I'll conclude with an assessment of the general state of collective action in democracy today. And then tomorrow, I'll take up the question of how the pieces come together, how we create conditions of belonging that enable us to build collective action at scale, and then what all this means for the possibilities and pathways for American democracy. So let me start by offering an illustration then of the ways in which not all forms of collective action are the same. Okay, so I don't know exactly who's in the room, although it's really lovely to see some familiar faces, especially faces from when I was in college, which is really lovely. But statistically speaking, I'll say that I know that because we're at an elite university campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I would guess that many people in this room bring considerable skepticism to the examination of the role of faith in American politics. There are obviously lots of weighty normative questions about the appropriate role of faith in politics, but these are questions I'm mostly going to bracket for now. Not because I want to say anything that undercuts the importance of religious freedom or the principle of separation of church and state, because liberalism, of course, demands such freedoms. But instead, I want to focus on faith institutions as sites from which we can examine the adjacent possible, to look into the dark matter, so to speak. So what do we learn from looking at the ways in which these institutions cultivate the capabilities and commitments that people need to make democracy work? So certainly in this year, in 2024, in the presidential election, there's no shortage of stories that have emerged or will emerge about the potentially threatening role that Christian evangelicals, especially white Christian evangelicals, play in our politics. Many people here are likely familiar with the headlines about the crucial role that white evangelical voters played and continue to play in the Trump coalition, and the way in which the rise of Christian nationalism is part of a longer historical quest for political power among the religious right. Consider this sample of recent headlines from the New York Times, The Atlantic, and PBS NewsHour. All of these stories chronicle the palpable rise of white Christian nationalist tendencies within American politics, its spread throughout the Republican base, and the threats that it poses to American democracy. Given the well-documented magnitude and the specter of the threat, many liberal audiences assume that conservative white Christian voters are one of the most active portions of the electorate. But if we look across the political aisle, Christian conservatives make precisely the opposite assumptions. In their view, it's not conservative white Christians that are taking over the electorate. Instead, it's liberal Christians. See, for instance, this is a tweet from Erica Anderson, who is a Christian writer, where she argues progressive churches are more likely to talk politics and candidates than conservative ones. Why aren't we discussing the Christian nationalism from the left? She argues that there's a double standard in how each side is covered. So how do we reconcile these competing claims? Liberals think conservative Christians are encroaching too far into politics. Conservatives think that liberal Christians who are. So what does the data say? So Ryan Burge is a professor of political science who is also an ordained Baptist minister, and he does a terrific job conducting empirical analyses of the relationship between religion and politics. And so he recently took data from the cooperative election study, which asked people whether or not they engaged in 4 different kinds of political activity in the last month: donating money to a political candidate, contacting a political official, volunteering for a candidate or a campaign, and then attending a protest or a march. And then he created an index of activity that and compared the participation amongst liberal, moderate, and conservative Christians. And essentially, if you look at the data, it shows that pretty consistently from 2012 to 2022, liberal Christians are consistently more active than conservative Christians, right? These are the blue dots here. And they're consistently engaging in more political activity than moderate Christians, who are the gray dots, or conservative Christians, who are in the middle and the red dots. And the differences become even starker if we look at the data broken down by race. Some may hypothesize that it's the activity of black Christians that is driving these trends, but it's actually not true. If you look at the same data by race, then what you see is that white Christians in the top graph are consistently different from other groups. Whoops, I don't know what just happened. Okay, are consistently different, and so essentially they're more active than any other category, and the gap between liberal Christians and conservative Christians is larger among white Christians than it is among non-white Christians. And so I could show you more graphs, but the bottom line is that no matter how we cut the data, the patterns are pretty robust. It's white liberal Christians who are the most active. And in fact, if we were to look at across all religious groups and not just Christians, then the other clear pattern that emerges is that atheists are the most politically active religious group. It's worth noting that these patterns hold even when we control for a variety of other factors like education or examine the data across a range of different forms of participation. And scholars often distinguish in looking at this kind of data between thick, time-intensive forms of participation and those are thin or less time-intensive. This data, however, includes both. It includes things like donating money, which are commonly perceived to be quick, individualistic forms of action, or volunteering for a candidate or campaign, or attending a protest or march, which is commonly thought of as being thick or a more time-intensive form of action. And so even if we were to break apart the scale and look, in other words, at each individual item, the pattern remains clear that it's not that progressives are engaging in quick and easy forms of activism while conservatives are engaging in deeper forms of action. The liberal Christians are consistently engaging in more activity of all kinds across both thin and thick actions. So why is it then that we see such a plethora of stories about the activism and power of the Christian right when it is actually the Christian left that is actually more active in American politics? I posed this question via email to a progressive evangelical pastor who I've gotten to know over the past couple of years, and he wrote back, quote, more progressive folks may be more likely to be political activists, but I'm not sure how that relates to any kind of serious power building. This is the big gap in my view. The MAGA end of the spectrum are definitely doing a lot of relationship and institution building, working through clergy and leaders, through homeschool movements, and so on. And so this pastor was making a crucial distinction between mere activism and activism connected to a larger strategy for building leaders, relationships, and institutions in pursuit of a larger strategy for power. The Christian left might have lots of people doing lots of stuff, he argued, but it was the Christian right that connected people engaged in a smaller volume of activity to each other, cultivated their leadership, and then embedded them in a set of institutions capable of projecting their actions onto a larger political agenda. Merely counting the number of people taking actions or looking at whose actions are the most time-consuming was not enough, in other words, to capture the differences between the different forms of collective action that each side engaged. So what does that tell us about our core question? How do we understand the different mechanics and the meaning of collective action in democracy? Very often, when people are thinking about collective action, there are two core questions that they're thinking about answering. First is who did how much activity and why? There's lots of people who study that, including me. And then, did those efforts actually make a difference? The pastor's point, in a way, is that there's an interrelationship between these two questions, and that there's a way in which our misunderstandings about question one shape our misperceptions about question two. And so if you put it in the context of our discussion today, then, to understand the bigger questions about the macro effects of collective action on things like democracy, we have to look to the micro foundations and the practices for how people are engaged. And the conventional ways that we have for differentiating different kinds of collective action, the number of people who've taken action, the number of actions that a person took, or the time intensiveness of those actions aren't sufficient. We have to look more deeply at the mechanics of collective action to understand its meanings. So to do so, I want to switch gears for a moment and step back and consider how we understand what democracy is and what role collective action plays in it. So I'm going to return at the end of today's lecture to make meaning of these distinctions between the liberal and the Christian conservatives that we just looked at. So to understand the role about collective action in the democratic project, we have to start by understanding what it is that democracy demands of people and how collective action equips them to meet those demands. So the first point that I want to make is that democracy demands that people experience their own agency. Democracy is a complex, interlocking system of institutions, organizations, and behaviors, and a set of shared norms and culture that inform and sustain all of the above. And as we confront this moment of democratic erosion around the world, democracy reformers each focus on different aspects of that system. Some focus on reconstructing or shoring up our political institutions. Still others are seeking to shape the political behaviors that people undertake. And still others are working to develop organizations focused on filling in the perceived gaps. I want to focus on norms and culture. What are the shared norms and culture necessary to sustain and nurture democracy, to make it work? As John Dewey argues, democracy is more than a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associational living. Democracy is the way a community figures out how to forge a common life together. As anyone who's been in any kind of family unit or a long-term relationship knows, however, forging a common life is hard. It takes a lot of work, especially in diverse, pluralistic communities. So what does it take for people to be willing to do that work? So I'd posit that the first thing it takes is people's commitment to making it work. When my husband and I fight, we can fight like we want to stay together, or we can fight like we want to get divorced. And this is potentially a good time to note that we've been together for 25 years, still are. But what I'm saying is that my and my husband's behaviors flow from the commitments that we have to each other. In our case, a commitment to stay together. And so for any community of people, forging a common life inevitably involves ups and downs, disappointments and victories, compromise and negotiation. Yet people have to be willing to stick with it, even in the hard times. And so if democracy is a process of people forging a common life together, then democracy is only as strong as people's commitment to that process. So what then does it take for people to commit to democracy? I often find myself asking these questions in conversations about democracy reform that ask about the norms and cultures needed for it. It seems that a number of scholars and practitioners that have been asking this question has really increased in recent years as people have become to realize that the foundations of American democracy are a lot weaker and a lot more fragile than some might have appreciated. And so given the stark levels of polarization confronting us, many answers about what the norms and culture are have focused on things like the habits and behaviors and commitments that it takes for people to depolarize, such as tolerance of opposing views, the humility to admit wrong, or the willingness to accept loss. And I fully agree, of course, that all of those behaviors and orientations are absolutely necessary for a liberal democratic order. But at the same time, sometimes when I'm in those conversations, I feel like they're jumping the gun. Because even as those orientations are foundational to making democracy work, they seem like second-order orientations relative to the first-order orientation of commitment. Mainly because tolerance, humility, and the acceptance of loss are all orientations that have to be learned. We've known from the earliest days of democracy that people aren't born with the habits and orientations that make collective democratic life possible. They have to learn them. And so we have to remember that democracy is asking people to do something that's really hard. One of my favorite definitions of democracy comes from Valerie Bunce, who's a scholar at Cornell, who says that democracy is unique among all other forms of government because it demands that people accept uncertainty over outcomes in order to have certainty over process. This is a quote from her. State socialism, by contrast, reverses this combination by featuring uncertain political procedures, but certain political results. And so put another way, in a democracy, people have to be willing to commit to sharing power with other people without knowing if their side is going to win. It's a challenge that's only exacerbated in diverse and heterogeneous societies. And so when their side loses, people have to be willing to accept the results. They have to commit to this project of power sharing across difference, even under conditions of uncertainty. And that's really hard. And so the audacious promise at the heart of democracy has thus always been that Deweyan or Tocquevillian associational life is what makes that kind of learning possible. But as all of us who are educators know, learning is hard. It takes commitment. And so the question is, where does that commitment originate? That commitment springs, at least in part, I think, from people's sense of their own agency. Somehow, however, a focus on people's agency, however, rarely comes up in their discussions of democratic norms and culture. I'd argue that people's sense of their own agency is not only a nice to have in democracy, but actually essential for it because it generates the commitments that democracy demands. Why would people commit to a system that deprives them of a sense of their own ability to realize their goals in life? When people experience a greater sense of their own agency, we expect that they'd be more likely to become committed to the system that engendered it. So political scientist Albert Hirschman theorized this interrelationship between agency and commitment in his prescient 1970 book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, which he wrote while he was at Harvard. Political organizations were distinct from market organizations, he argued, because they're instead of operating on a logic of exit, as he said, they had to operate on what he called a logic of voice. When people were upset by what the organization was doing, instead of exiting the organization or purchasing another product, they had to have avenues for exercising voice or expressing their discontent. But for people to exercise that voice, they must be loyal, right? They must be committed enough to the organization to want to do the work of trying to fix it. There are two other scholars, Sherry Wu and Betsy Levy-Pollack, who've run experimental studies in the workplace, which look at the same relationship between agency and commitment. In their study, they randomly assigned workers to different kinds of meetings. In the treatment group, the supervisor stepped aside during weekly participatory meetings and allowed workers to self-facilitate discussions in which they identified goals they wanted to attain, problems they wanted to solve, and develop strategies to achieve the goals that they set out. People assigned to the control group also attended weekly meetings at their workplace, but they were more typical hierarchical meetings in which the supervisor set the goals and strategies, and the workers listened. And across multiple papers, including this one, Wu and Pollack found that workers randomly assigned to the treatment group were much more likely to feel empowered, they had a greater sense of control, and this made them more likely to be satisfied with their jobs, more productive at work, and they were more likely to participate in political and social activity outside of the workplace. And so a larger literature on high-performance work practices verifies this intuition, that increasing people's sense of their own agency increases their commitment to the work and in many cases other attendant behaviors. And so I want to treat these kind of opportunities for exercising agency then as a first-order problem to be solved in democratic life, because it helps generate the commitments that we need. Any effort to revitalize democracy then should focus on the question of how we generate people's agency so that they can become more committed to the system that produced it. So that brings me to my next point, which is that cultivating agency involves enabling people to take risks. To understand where people's agency originates, we first have to understand what agency is. And so I've long been dismayed by what I perceive to be relatively narrow conceptualizations of agency in my field, which is the empirical study of American politics, because too often my colleagues in the field conflate the study of agency and efficacy, treating them as interchangeable concepts. And agency is usually conceptualized as my own self-perception about whether or not I matter or have efficacy within the political system. And as a practical matter, it gets measured through a set of 4 questions from surveys like the American National Election Study that ask respondents how much decision makers care about people like them. What these definitions miss is that agency is a function of so much more than how a person feels about themselves. And so here I draw on Peter Levine's work, who I think is here today, and his terrific book called What Should We Do?, which everyone should read. As Levine writes, one way to understand agency is to consider the ability of communities or people to answer the question, what should we do? And he argues that each of these 4 words in the title is really important for understanding what agency is. What? Agency has to be grounded in a person or a community's goals and aspirations. Should? People's assessment of should I act is based on both their assessment of how I feel, their efficacy, but also whether they have the opportunity to act on the world. Educational psychologists, for example, conceptualize a student's motivation in school as a function of both their ability to achieve their goals, but also their expectations of whether they're in an environment conducive to acting on those goals. So a student might feel like she's good at math, but if she lacks a classroom in which the teacher or she's in a classroom in which the teacher diminishes her math ability, she lacks the motivation to try. And so likewise, a person considering democratic action is going to assess not only their own competencies, but also the constraints and affordances in their environment around them. And so the word should implies that the question is contested, that people have to negotiate that question because the answers aren't clear. They have to contend with the unpredictability. So we is the 3rd word. Levine focuses on collective action, which is inherently a question about we and not I. For our purposes, it's worth noting that agency has both these individual and collective dimensions to it. And then finally, do. Agency is about action. It's about people's ability to act in the world. It's not people's answer to the question, what should I believe or what should I think? But instead, it's about people's assessment of what actions they do or do not want to take in the world. And so people who are agents within a democratic process don't just consume the choices they are given. When people are acting as agents, they act interdependently to identify problems, to strategize solutions, and then marshal the resources that they need to put those solutions into action. To develop a definition of what he calls civic agency, Levine draws on John Dewey, who argues that people need the opportunity to participate. Oops, someone's getting a call. To participate in scientific democratic learning communities. Dewey argues that democratic action is inherently both scientific and about learning because it is experimental, as democratic action is constantly about trying new things. And so in Dewey's conceptualization, people working together are constantly trying to learn from their successes and failures and cumulatively producing knowledge over time about how to engage in their shared projects. And so his focus on experimentation and learning, I think, is consistent with the studies of worker empowerment that we looked at before. As that body of research has found, people's sense of agency or empowerment springs not from adhering to a set of prescribed tasks that someone else defines, but instead from figuring out their own solutions to the problems that they face. And so cultivating people's agency thus involves risk, because people need to face the prospect of failure to develop a visceral sense of how they can become purposeful actors in the public sphere. And people need the experience of trying something, failing, rethinking their strategy, and trying again. Just as children have to engage in a repeated process of trying, failing, and trying again to learn, so too do democratic agents. And so it's through this iterative process of learning risk and reward that people develop a sense of their own ability to strategize about the problems they want to solve. And so they begin, instead of feeling like pawns in a game that someone else is controlling, they begin to see themselves as strategists in the game itself. So people don't develop that agency if they're executing actions that have only a predictable outcome. So putting the pieces together then, I've started by arguing that to make democracy work, people have to be committed to it. And that, in particular, people have to be committed to the project of power sharing that Valerie Bunce described under conditions of uncertainty. Second, that people's commitment springs at least partly from their sense of their own agency, and that people have to transform to from feeling like objects to subjects in the project of democracy. And then third, that cultivating agency depends on people undertaking actions that involve some kind of risk or unpredictability. So now we can turn to set a question about what are the kinds of experiences that people have in democratic life, and what is the extent to which they meet these criteria that we just laid out. And so in the next section, what I want to do is I want to argue that most people are not given the opportunity to exercise their agency in democratic life. And so I want to give you an example of what it looks like when people actually exercise their agency and embrace the kind of unpredictability and risk that we've been discussing. And so the example comes from a church that I started studying about 8 years ago. I happened upon a group of people at this church who were organizing around racial justice within the context of a white-dominant evangelical megachurch in southern Ohio and Cincinnati. And I wasn't intending to embark on research in this community, but I'd been doing research on a ballot initiative in Cincinnati that won an improbable victory for universal preschool in 2016. And given prevalent media narratives about the white evangelical community, I was puzzled by the overwhelming support that evangelical voters offered to the Cincinnati campaign, given that the ballot initiative was explicitly framed and designed to ameliorate racial inequality in the city. So Crossroads, the church in Ohio that I've been studying, it has a scale that exceeds almost any grassroots political organization that I know in America. They get about 35,000 people per week to show up in person for services, an additional 500,000 people that tune in online. Their annual budget's about $65 million. They're a community that's 80% white and white dominant in both leadership and culture. And their non-white population is predominantly black, given the demographics of northern Kentucky and southern Ohio, where they draw their population from. And so if you have a stereotype about evangelical megachurches in the Midwest, Crossroads probably breaks it in many ways. This is a picture of two of their top pastors in the church and advertising their annual Super Bowl of preaching. It's an event designed to draw people to church even on Super Bowl Sunday. It got so big that the NFL forced them to change the name of it because they were infringing on the trademark name Super Bowl. And it's so fun that when my 7-year-old once watched it on video with me, my 7-year-old who was not raised Christian turned to me and solemnly declared, "Mom, I think I'm Christian." The community definitely leans conservative from a political standpoint, but it's hardly the Trump loyalist community that one might surmise from reading the headlines about evangelicalism in America. Even in 2016, when I first began studying them, I was struck by the fact that in a moment when most other social and political organizations seemed to become increasingly homogenous, Crossroads was a community that had both pro-Trump and anti-Trump voters, people who are both pro-life and pro-choice, and those who are pro-gun rights and those who oppose them. And so what was surprising to me also, though, was that all the Crossroads congregants that I talked to who got involved in this campaign all credited an anti-racism program called Undivided as the source of their motivation. Repeatedly, they kept telling me that it was Undivided that motivated them to take actions that they had never considered before. And I was kind of baffled by this because when people described Undivided to me, it sounded an awful lot like DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, that many of us had to suffer through in our workplaces. And Undivided, indeed, is a 6-week program that's designed to teach people about racism and racial injustice in America, and then equip them with basic skills for confronting their own racial biases and considering what they can do to confront racism in society. And so participants in Undivided would meet once a week for a couple hours to learn some new content. They would work in small groups of 6 to 10 people to practice new skills and then reflect together on what they learned. It taught them about things like the history of racial injustice in Cincinnati, the neuroscience of empathy and what we might do to be able to invoke empathy for people who are different from us. It gave them statistics on the interconnectedness of racial disparities in America, and many other kind of programs. And so many of these exercises are probably familiar to those of us who have had to participate in different DEI programs. As Frank Dobbin, who's a faculty member here, wrote about, many such programs have developed in the 1970s as a response to both changing cultural norms following the civil rights movement and legal requirements imposed on employers. But the research on such programs shows that most of them are largely ineffective. Multiple meta-analyses have found that efforts to reduce people's prejudices have limited effects on attitudes at best, and sometimes can even invoke backlash. And so in some cases, when you have programs like this, I was puzzled that so many people seem to testify the outsized impact of Undivided on their behaviors. And so when I dug into Undivided, I found many things that surprised me, many of which were recounted in a book that I have forthcoming this September, shameless plug, with Knopf. But I want to emphasize one aspect here, namely the choice that Undivided leaders made about how to structure the small groups in which people would practice the skills that they were taught. So Undivided was first started in 2015 when Chuck Mingo, who is the black pastor that was pictured on the screen, preached about his calling to act on racial injustice. And he received an unexpected outpouring of support from the Crossroads community. And so, surprised by the response, Chuck assembled a leadership team, a multiracial planning team, of leaders from the church and the city to help him develop what eventually became the Undivided program. And so one question the planning team hotly debated during their planning sessions was the construction of the small groups that they were going to put people in. How should they assign people to the breakout groups? They were debating in particular whether they should A, let people self-organize into small groups, leaving the composition of the groups up to chance, Or B, intentionally organize people into groups with other people of the same race. Or C, intentionally construct groups with a cross-racial mix. And so an advisor that the planning team brought in from Procter & Gamble, which is a big company based in Cincinnati, argued that the racial composition of the small groups was irrelevant. She was acting off the same premise that underlies many DEI programs, namely that prejudice reduction depends on teaching people the error of their ways. The goal of these programs is to pour information about bias and discrimination into people's heads and then remove their blindfolds to injustice to thereby change their behavior. And such programs often seek to minimize risk instead of promoting it because they're trying to script people's experiences and spoon feed them a menu of uncontroversial actions or put them into a legalistic vice. So in this formulation, to her, the structure of the small groups didn't matter as much as the information that people were receiving. The undivided planning team, on the other hand, they instinctively felt that those underlying assumptions were wrong. In their minds, undivided would fail if it only imparted information. They wanted participants, both Black and white, to develop experiences of vulnerability and solidarity across race, however tentative those experiences might be. And so in their mind, the racial composition of the groups really did matter because the groups were essentially ground zero for people making meaning out of what they were learning, formulating choices about if and how they wanted to act, and then seeing how people around them reacted. And so the planning team felt that it was important for people to engage with people's reactions across race. And so for this reason, they committed to creating racially balanced groups. And indeed, when I interviewed them, many of the participants in Undivided had forgotten the curriculum that was shared with them, but they remembered the people in their small groups and could often describe minute reactions they observed from people around them as they were trying these different actions out. So Jess is a white woman who had grown up with a father who literally had the words white power tattooed on the back of his triceps, and she could recount with extraordinary detail the reaction of the Black men and women in her small group when she first shared stories about her father with the group. She had started the Undivided experience unsure of how honest she was going to be about her past, but when she decided to speak truthfully, she kept a watchful eye on the people around her. Sandra was a Black woman who had grown up in a conservative Black Christian family in California, and she confronted what she called her own quote-unquote racial wounds during the Undivided program. She had started Undivided thinking racism was a problem for white people to address, but she was surprised during the program to be prompted to excavate her own orientations to her racial identity. And as she opened herself to the work, she described being grateful for other people in her small group, Black and white, who were willing to expose themselves to the same kind of vulnerability. And their willingness to dig in made it easier for her to do the same. And so the small groups, in other words, were places where people like Sandra and Jess and many others constructed relationships with people across race, thus creating a social context that enabled them to explore and expose their own vulnerabilities around it. And once exposed, they then had a trusted space in which they could observe the reactions of people around them and negotiate their responses in return. And so through an iterative process, Sandra and Jess could identify their own pathways to thinking about and acting on anti-racism. And so one indication of the impact of such opportunities is their behavior after Undivided ended. So coming out of their program, Jess, Sandra, and hundreds of others became so committed to this project of anti-racism grounded in action that they became ardent volunteers for Issue 44, which is a 2016 ballot initiative. It raised taxes to build a universal preschool program with targeted resources for the poor, mostly Black community in Cincinnati. And the levy was able to raise taxes in 2016 in Ohio, which is the same state that helped put Donald Trump in the White House the same year that the measure was on the ballot. But Undivided volunteers committed so fervently to the campaign that the campaign manager marveled at the extent to which it seemed like a mission to them, and it was, quote unquote, unlike anything that he had ever seen. As a result, Issue 44 passed by the largest margin of any new education levy in Cincinnati's history. And so in Undivided, Sandra and Jess and many others like them had to reach beyond their comfort zones to explore new questions the program was raising about how they understood themselves and who they wanted to be in that world. And as they were formulating and testing these new ways of being, they were acting within the context of these small groups and consciously and unconsciously chronicling the reactions of the people around them. Their journeys weren't easy, they weren't linear, but the important point here is that they also would not have had those opportunities if Undivided had not given them the chance to do so. So what does that mean about our study of collective action? So here's my next point. People's opportunity to develop their agency in democratic life is a supply-side question. It's not just a demand-side question. And so in many conversations about democratic erosion, about the challenging norms and behaviors that people have to adopt to make democracy work, the temptation is often to look at the people and ask why they aren't willing to be good democratic citizens. For instance, why aren't they more committed to democracy? Why aren't they more tolerant of others? Why are they so polarized? And so that's what I refer to as a demand-side approach. What if we were to explore the supply side? Instead of asking why people don't exhibit the behaviors that we want, what if we were instead to ask what are the kinds of opportunities they're being invited into? In other words, what kind of participatory opportunities for action are people encountering? Are they more likely to encounter the kinds of scripted DEI opportunities that the Procter & Gamble advisor was promoting? Or are they more likely to encounter opportunities like Undivided that set people off on unpredictable journeys of exploration and tension? And so here I want to tell a story about a friend and colleague, Joy. She grew up in a conservative evangelical community in rural Maine. Her dad was a farmer, and when Joy was very young, he could see that farming was not going to be a viable life for their family for very long. And so on the first day of first grade, he picked Joy up from school and he took her to McDonald's, and he told her that she better get good grades because school was going to be her only ticket to a better life. And so indeed, when Joy was 14, her parents had to declare bankruptcy and give up their family farm. And so Joy had to watch her parents beg from the church to get food and clothes to make it through the Maine winter. But Joy listened to her father, and she studied hard, and so she was able to go to college. She got into Bowdoin and received enough scholarships and financial aid that she was able to go. But she spent most of her time at Bowdoin for the first few years being very quiet. She felt very overshadowed by her classmates who were wealthier, more polished, she felt, and more worldly than she was. But while she was in college, Bowdoin considered giving up its need-blind financial aid policy. And for the first time, Joy spoke up. She knew that if Bowdoin gave up its need-blind financial aid, that students like her would never make it there. So she reached out to other students on financial aid, and they got together to meet with university leaders to convince them not to change their policy. And so that experience of speaking up and working with others it awoke something in Joy. So after college, she wasn't sure what political organizing was, but she decided it was probably something that she wanted to do. So she got hired as an organizer, and she was assigned a neighborhood that she should canvass for her cause. She spent her days knocking on doors, trying to stop people from slamming the doors in her face and convincing them to support her cause. And after months of doing that day in and day out, Joy remembered walking outside after having one too many doors slammed in her face. And she looked up at the stars in the sky, and she said, "What am I doing here?" She was spending all day trying to convince people to support the cause that she was working for. And even when she was successful, people would get all riled up and then ask her, "Well, what can I do?" And the only thing she had to offer them was the opportunity to make a donation. Where is the dignity in that? She asked herself. Instead of giving people the opportunity to design their own solutions to the problems they saw in their community, she was offering them the chance to outsource their outrage to someone else. Joy decided if that's what it meant to organize people for political action, then it wasn't for her. And so Joy's revelation illustrates the difference between a system that offers opportunities to exercise risk versus a system that seeks to minimize it. Joy realized that her employers were asking her to treat people as what she calls containers of extractable resources. They were cogs in a machine that someone else designed. And in this case, Joy's employers wanted money from people, but they could have been asking for things like signatures on a petition, data, or something else. In all these cases, people are treated merely as people with opinions that they could express through voice, rather than people who can make choices themselves. And so the only choice they had was the opportunity to express an opinion or not. They were never given the chance to consider how they might want to define the problem or who they wanted to work with or what the solutions might be. They were never given a chance, in other words, to explore what we might call the adjacent possible. And so in that context, experimentation and learning was largely removed from people's experience in democracy, and people's experience in politics became solely a process of proffering their opinions to others who then aggregated their expressed views. And so the risks were negligible. And so how unique is Joy's experience? How does it compare to the kinds of opportunities that people are offered nowadays? If we look at the data, basically, we see that nowadays most people are not invited into collective activities that cultivate their agency. The data show that the most likely ways that people engage with democracy are through actions like voting, signing petitions, expressing opinions to each other, or reading the news. And so all of these actions are important and foundational to democracy, but we lose something essential if that's the only thing that people do. So consider reading the news. Consuming news media so that people can become informed denizens of the communities they inhabit is crucial, of course. But reading the news is most often a record of decisions that other people make, right? What about things like signing petitions or expressing opinions through voting and social media? Such mechanisms are crucial ways that people communicate their preferences as decision makers in government. But what happens to our democracy when people express it only as a way to express views and then wait for other people to make decisions that they get to read about in the news later? Does that help them answer the question, what should we do, or cultivate their own agency? And so the most common forms of participation that we see nowadays largely scrubbed most actions of their ability to cultivate agency. And so there are 4 aspects to highlight. First is that most actions are solitary. The most common participatory actions that are most likely to be things that people can do alone rather than things that they force them to work with others. And so they're not truly collective, which means that people aren't developing the habits of exploring the adjacent possible, trying new things, and embracing unpredictability. And so in a study that I conducted with Michelle Oyakawa and Elizabeth McKenna, we found that many organizers argue that the most challenging risks that they faced were social risks, the relational costs of reaching out to, recruiting, and organizing people. And so every time someone asks someone else to take action with them, to join a cause, to do something, they risk rejection or backlash or other kinds of social approbation. And if the actions that people take are mostly solitary, they're never given the option to become comfortable with such risks. Second, the actions that people take are mainly expressive, and they focus on expression over strategy. So most actions invite people to express their views about problems or possible solutions, but never invite them into the process of identifying the problem or brainstorming solutions. And so people can only choose whether or not they want to express their opinion. And so when expression is the only avenue that people see for acting on problems in the world, it's no surprise that their forms of expression become louder, more extreme, and more categorical. This also shapes, I would argue, the forms of identity politics that emerge. When people are treated categorically, they come to understand themselves and their own role in the political process and others as categories. Third, people are treated as objects. So a related characteristic of these common acts of participation is that the individuals who take the action are largely interchangeable. So if the power of collective action doesn't depend on me doing something, but on anyone doing something, then I become nothing more than a warm body. It doesn't matter if I am the one who chooses to vote or sign a petition or like a post, but instead it just matters that someone does. And so power then, in that strategy, is built merely through accumulation, such that the whole is just the additive sum of the parts. When I first got involved in politics, I remember a mentor who told me that a simple lesson I should always remember is that people are not stupid. People know when they are being treated as interchangeable cogs in a machine or merely objects for other people to control, and when they are truly valued for who they are and the gifts that they might uniquely bring. When people become accustomed to being treated as objects, my mentor argued, then they respond in kind. Politics becomes a transaction, and people treated as interchangeable boxes begin to treat others the same. Fourth and finally, the actions that people are asked to take nowadays are not nested in durable organizations. They focus on exit over voice, to use Hirschman's terms. And so they're much more likely to be nested in campaigns or networks that freely enable people to exit, essentially, when the going gets tough. And so without the opportunity to exercise loyalty and voice, people miss something essential in democracy. If people leave whenever things get hard, they never learn the skills of negotiation, of compromise, of deliberation, and so on that make democracy work. And part of it is because organizations demand sacrifice. There's a great quote from the New Yorker writer Nick Lemon, who wrote when he was analyzing what it would take to overcome kind of the inequality that we see in America. He wrote, "Consequential human activity takes place through institutions. Media and messaging meant to influence public opinion, organizing campaigns conducted only on social media, these are the snack foods of politics, far less effective over the long term than building institutions that have more conventional functions like structured meetings, ongoing rituals, and planned campaigns." And so without organizations, people become consumers of the opportunities that different organizations set up, and they choose amongst them like they might choose cereal at a grocery store. The opportunities for the kind of Deweyan, Tocquevillian transformation disappear if people don't stick around long enough to engage in the ongoing work of negotiating power and interests among different people. So put together then, the experience of democracy that the data shows that most people have through common acts of participation is that participating in democracy is an individual act of expression in which they shop amongst choices for action that different organizations offer. And their action is one unit in a mass-produced set of transactions. And so is this the experience of democracy that we want people to have? Is this what will teach people how to share power across difference and to accept the uncertainty that democracy demands? And so in this sense, the practice of collective action often doesn't seem to meet democracy's demands. So what is the alternative? So I started the lecture today by posing a puzzle. Why is it that we see such a plethora of stories about the power of the Christian right when in fact it is the Christian left that is actually more active in American politics? And so I wanted to start with this example to underscore the point that not all forms of collective action are the same, and that the conceptual tools that we commonly use to differentiate the mechanics of collective action are insufficient to help us understand the variation, the meaning, and mechanics of collective action. So what have we learned then today about the mechanics and meanings of collective action? So to answer this question, I went back and I asked what it is that democracy demands of people. And so while many people have discussed this, what I call the second order demands that a liberal democratic order makes of people, tolerance, willingness to accept loss, willingness to hear opposing views, and so on, I argue that a first order demand is agency. And that democracy needs people to feel like agents within it because agency cultivates the commitment to the system that democracy needs. But the challenge of cultivating agency in part is a supply side question, right? People need opportunities to be able to develop that agency. And so this led me to examine what kinds of participatory opportunities people have and how they are designed. And too many people, I argued, are never given the chance to develop their agency because they're never given the chance to exercise any kind of meaningful risk or to operate in a durable organization that demands the kind of sacrifices that enable democratic learning. Too many suppliers of participation do not allow people to essentially become anything. Instead, people are spoon-fed a menu of actions they can take that are most likely to be solitary, expressive acts in which their individual gifts and complexities are ignored. And so many of us have witnessed that in the DEI programs that we had to undertake at our workplaces. We saw that in my friend Joy's experience. And yet, through programs like Undivided, we can glimpse what are adjacent possibilities. And so what does this tell us then about our puzzle, about the distinctions between the political activity of liberal Christians and conservative Christians? And I should just specify here that even though Crossroads and Undivided are evangelical programs, they aren't themselves associated with the Christian right. That distinction alone kind of highlights the fact that there's more heterogeneity in that community, I think, than is commonly understood. But the point I want to make here is that if we do look at the differences between liberal and conservative Christians, I would argue that the key ones to look at are supply-side differences, namely the kinds of opportunities for action that characterize activity on either side. So on the left, we see people being invited into scripted actions that allow them to add their vote to a ballot, their name to a petition, their dollars to a campaign, or their bodies to a protest. They're actions that are largely devoid of risk or sacrifice on the participants' part and mostly focused on expending their bodies, their ballots, their bucks to add their voice to forms of expression that other people get to develop. And rarely are people offered the opportunity to strategize as agents about what to do. And on the other hand, the Christian right, in contrast, has been constructing a network of organizations that create essentially containers within which people act. They recruit people into these organizations, they connect them to each other, and then enable them not only to do things, but to become problem solvers, to become the kind of people who do what needs to be done. So the focus is on creating these containers for action as much as it is about generating action itself. In adjusting reference to the importance of such organizations, my colleague Laura Putnam likes to say, it's the bylaws, stupid. Just as leaders of Undivided thought carefully about how to create the small groups by constructing these vehicles for action carefully, they can free people to develop their own agency with them. And so as a result, these organizations can project their smaller volume of activity onto a larger landscape of power. So tomorrow, I want to dive more deeply into questions of how opportunities for collective action can be designed, but with an eye towards two particular questions that you might be sitting with today. So first, there's a potential paradox of becoming. I spent today talking about why we need to let people become themselves in a way, but by focusing on people's agency, then we cultivate their ability to pursue a political agenda. And so when they pursue agendas, they might pursue agendas that go towards illiberal ends. So put another way, the trouble with cultivating people's agency is that they become agents. And once people start pursuing their own agenda, it can go in lots of unpredictable directions. And so further, by engaging people in activism and allowing them to pursue a political agenda, sometimes that can seem antithetical to the goals of sober deliberation, humility, questioning, and tolerance that characterize the democratic order. And so consider much of the research, for example, on collective action that shows that activists are committed ideologues driven by maniacal, uncompromising commitments to particular policy outcomes. The fear is that by cultivating people as agents, maybe more of them could turn towards illiberal ends. The second question that people might be sitting with is skepticism about the ability to generate the kind of collective action that I'm describing at any kind of scale. If what I'm talking about is only available to a very small number of people, then what's the point, really? So how do we answer these questions? So here I want to return to the basic point that I'm trying to make throughout these lectures, which is that not all forms of collective action are the same, and the design and distribution of the opportunities that people are offered really matters. It is absolutely true that there are forms of collective action that lead people towards illiberal ends. And we also see cases in which there are activists who take these kind of extremist, uncompromising positions. But as I've argued today about places like Undivided, if we examine the adjacent possible, the places on both the left and the right where people are being invited into opportunities to engage with the dignity of their whole selves, where they're given chances to act and to fail, and where they're put into positions of working with people across difference, then what we see are in situations in which people learn to engage the complexity of doing actual small p politics. They learn to negotiate difference, to understand their identities as experiences instead of categories, and to realize their full selves as democratic agents. So it's not just that we have to be inviting people into collective action, but also we have to think about what the conditions are that we create and the experiences that we design. And so today I focused on risk and organization as two conditions that we want to focus on. What else do we want to look at in terms of the conditions that make it more likely that people go in democratic as opposed to anti-democratic directions? And so these are the questions that I'll take up tomorrow. I want to talk about the conditions that are needed to make transformative collective action in a way that deepens democracy possible. And I'll focus on both the kind of relational context and the structural conditions that allow us to build at scale the kind of organizations that offer the sort of pro-democratic, agency-producing collective action that we've been talking about. I'll argue that we can I'll draw on a big data project that my colleagues and I have been undertaking to map the landscape of civic opportunity in the United States to show both what is present and what is possible, and to extend our discussion of some outlying cases to discuss what's going to take to build more of these opportunities at the scale that we want. So thank you.
All right. This is so exciting. I'm going to go ahead and, I guess, maybe we'll just do that. Put it down a little bit. Good afternoon. It is such a pleasure and honor to have the chance to respond to Professor Hahn's lecture. I have admired her and her work and learned so much from it for so many years. And I knew the lectures today were going to be a gift, not just a gift from the Tanners, but a gift from Professor Hahn. And it's true, right? You all experienced that and felt it. Let me just start by saying thank you, Professor Clark, Professor Carvalho, President Garber, President Gay. We appreciate that you've made the space for this conversation and appreciate your presence for this conversation. I was walking over here this afternoon, actually, and remembering that in my first year in graduate school, I came to a set of Tanner lectures, so 96, 97. So were you saying that that was the first year of Tanner lectures, President Garber? So there you go, look at that. And I left that lecture with a question that turned into a book that got published in 2010. So the point is just that for the graduate students in the room, I am sure there is inspiration here, and I look forward to seeing the books you guys are going to write in the years ahead. And so thank you again, Professor Hahn, for the teaching. So that was an incredibly rich lecture, and Professor Hahn started from her own story of commitment, her experience protesting on the Harvard campus, and the fact that that was a magical, I think, intoxicating experience, you said. It was taking risks, it was asking the question, what should we do? And it gave you a lifelong curiosity and concern for collective action. I also am a person who is committed to democracy. It's 24/7. People ask me what I do, and I just say, I work on democracy, like past, present, and future thereof, with no question mark on the end of that. And then they always ask me, well, why do you care so much, Danielle? Really the question that Professor Hahn was also asking. And I have a habit of answering that question by referring to my old ancestors. As Marshall knows, I'll talk about my granddad, who helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in northern Florida in the 40s. So super dangerous. Northern Florida is basically the same thing as southern Georgia. So he was taking his life into his hands. Lynchings were on the rise at the time. And I will talk about my great-grandparents who fought for women's right to vote, and like to lift up my great-granddad, who, as an early ally, he marched with suffragettes on Boston Common. And the point of those people, their stories, is simply that they were all people who considered empowerment, or agency, the bedrock for human thriving. They were often told that something was impossible, like social equality for African Americans was impossible in the South, or women having the right to vote was impossible. And their answer was no, not only not impossible, but necessary. And so the only question is how. And so that is the sort of set of stories and lessons that I grew up with, and very much sort of anchor me in my own orientation to the importance of democracy. But it's also the case that when I tell those stories, people will say, that doesn't really explain you, Danielle. That doesn't really explain why you're committed to democracy, or why I should be. And it's particularly young people who say that back to me, but that doesn't really give me a reason to commit. And so I do have an answer to that question of where my own commitment comes from, but Professor Hahn has given me a vocabulary for it today, I think, which I hadn't had previously. So the story of my commitment then goes on to a sort of second phase where I explain that because of those ancestors, I was fortunate to grow up in a world of just super civically engaged people and people who were engaged across the political spectrum. And so there was this one crazy year in my youth, 1992, where my aunt was running for Congress. She was on the ballot for Congress for the Peace and Freedom Party in the Bay Area in California, far left side of the spectrum. My dad, in the very same year, was running for US Senate from Southern California as a Reagan Republican. And so we had incredible dinner table conversations, because we were a very close family, we spent a lot of time together. And they would go at it, hammer and tongs, back and forth. My dad was like smoking a pipe all the time, pipe smoke curling around his head, super professorial. My aunt was a big woman, built like a Mack truck, huge belly laugh. She was gay. They had very different perspectives on things, and my dad would make the case for, market liberties and civic virtues, and my aunt would make the case for public sector investments across all aspects of society and experiments in living. They had fought it out. They never broke the bond of commitment to each other. They were committed to that relationship. They were always there to help each other if either needed help with anything. They fought out political battles in California. They would beat each other, or, one side was always winning, the other side always losing, and they always came back to the table to, again, fight over that question of what should we do? What should we do? And I've often described that story as being a space where I learned an ethic that I like to call, borrowing from the legal scholar Johnny Nazu, confident pluralism, which I think you also articulated beautifully today. What the folks in Undivided are learning is confident pluralism, to be vulnerable with others who are different, to know what you stand for, to be able to speak for that, but make space for the others, and then wrestle together to a solution. But what Professor Hahn has helped me understand, which I hadn't seen before, was that those conversations between my dad and my aunt were an invitation to me into that conversation about what should we do. That's the part I had missed. That every single one of those conversations where, there were lots of us kids, youngsters around, and to this day I go home and friends I knew at high school say, remember those conversations in your family's dining room? And for all of us there, that's what it was. It was an invitation to exactly that. And as my colleagues will know, I've never been shy to step into what should we do question. And I think that is the important point of the story, that even though it was a private space, a small group space, it wasn't, in a sense, directly about what we formally think of as political action, a vote, a petition, and the like. It was that invitation into the what should we do conversation. So thank you for solving that puzzle for me. Because when, especially younger folks, ask me this question, like, where should our commitment to democracy come from, or what's its basis, what I have historically done is give them a very abstract answer. I say, empowerment. I do say agency sometimes, and they'll say, oh, that doesn't really help. It doesn't really tell me how to get going. And then I'll sometimes say, well, it does feel good, all right? Empowerment feels good. But what you've done, Professor Hahn, is really articulate and break down why empowerment feels good, what the invitation is an invitation to. And you're going to tell us more about it, I think, tomorrow as well, as you really dig into this word becoming that you've given us for the name of it, the word belonging that you've also given us for it. But exactly this, sharing of power in conditions of uncertainty. That's the phrase you've gotten. And that is, despite its complexities, a happy place. A happy place. Those fights around our dining room table were a happy place for me. There was literally a positive emotional affect to them. And so again, the story that you tell about Undivided really communicates the importance of that strong, positive affect. So let me just back up again, because then, in addition to answering the puzzle about where motivation for democracy comes from, the answer is agency, but agency is a happy place, and it's about belonging and becoming. In addition to answering that puzzle, Professor Hahn has also answered the second question of, why were we so puzzled in the first place? Because once we hear the answer, it kind of feels obvious, if I may say, and I don't mean that in any way to diminish the importance of the argument, but it's sort of a self-evident truth, in a sense, sort of obvious in that kind of way. So then why were we so puzzled? And this is where the comparison that Professor Hahn offers us is so important, when she digs into the mechanics and meaning of collective action with the two case studies of liberal Christian, I don't know if they were all evangelicals or liberal Christian, politically engaged people, and then conservative Christian engagement. And the picture, on the one hand, of a practice which is about donating, contacting a public official, volunteering, attending a protest or march. And then on the alternative, as we were hearing, the small groups that may or may not have a civic purpose immediately, but are the small group, what should we do conversation, that leads to collaboration, compromise, negotiation in context of pluralism, and then where there is an easy bridge from that kind of participation to issue advocacy groups, like the Ballot Initiative in Ohio. So these are two very different pictures of the mechanics of collective action. And as Professor Hahn spelled out, the first is solitary. It's about expression over strategy, or voice over actual influence. People are objectified, they're instrumentalized. They don't get the chance to participate in institutions. That is such an important part of people's realization of that experience of agency. And then, of course, on the other side, all the opposite things of this, an extractive model versus a nourishing model that supports human flourishing. Now, when we have all these two models spelled out for us, what we recognize is that that first model, focusing on that list of actions, donations, contacting a public official, volunteering, and so forth, well, those are exactly the kinds of actions that we political scientists conventionally count as being a democratic citizen. When we do survey work, when we're trying to figure out how engaged people are, those are the categories that we use. When you even look through civic education curricula developed around the nation, those are the categories people use to indicate to young people precisely what they should be aspiring to as they grow into citizenship. And as Professor Hahn has shown, the experience of participating in those things is not fulfilling at a very rudimentary level, again, because it's extractive. It's instrumentalizing, it's solitary. It does not involve that invitation into the what should we do conversation. So we've been puzzled about where the motivation for democracy can come from, where the commitment can come from, because we've actually built a whole sort of shadow apparatus, like a platonic shadow of the form of democratic participation. It's not the real thing, but we keep pretending it's the real thing. And of course, it doesn't generate the sort of intrinsic rewards, the intrinsic value that genuine democratic action should generate. Because we look at that, we keep studying that, there is no motivation connected to it, and we get very puzzled about where the motivation for democracy is. So the consequence of seeing that mistake in our field is that it actually means we political scientists have a heck of a lot of work to do, to displace some standard survey questions, to reconsider some of the frameworks we use for qualitative work, to really start to flesh out anew what the research agenda should be for understanding that supply side picture of whether we're offering people those invitations into the what should we do conversation. And the stakes really couldn't be higher. As everybody here knows, we do sit in a time of very significantly declining connection and commitment to democracy. And as Professor Hahn said to start, you can't have a democracy if people don't want a democracy. So if we are, in fact, undermining commitment to democracy by means of the tools that we are supposedly using to advance democracy, we are in a very serious, vicious cycle that requires breaking. So with that, I don't want to anymore anticipate the important further lessons that Professor Hahn has to offer for how we can break the cycle. That really will be the theme of tomorrow's lecture. At this point, what I'd love to do is say thank you once again for a brilliant lecture. We can give Professor Hahn another round of applause and then invite you up to the stage for a conversation. So I think we have about 15 minutes for questions and comments. And I believe there are mics coming up and down the aisles. And there's so much to talk about here, so please don't be shy. Oh, and I've got a whole list of other questions, by the way, so good, okay, which I didn't get to.
Yeah.
Thank you both for this great lecture and for this great recasting of the great lecture. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm on the faculty at the Graduate School of Education, so I'm going to ask the obvious question. What should we be doing in 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade civics classes or history classes to prepare students to participate in the kind of committed democratic action that you've described as optimal?
Sure. Well, I'm sure Danielle has a lot of thoughts on this too, so I'll offer a few thoughts, but then would love to hear what you have to say. When I look, so our kids are 16 and 12 now, and so when I look at sort of what they've been invited to do in school, I think they're often invited into more opportunities to kind of think about what they want to do, and so our youngest child organized a protest at not wanting to wear jackets at recess, and it was a very small, action to take within his own domain of activity. But it was, our child practicing like how to get other people involved, how to convince them that the jacket rule was inappropriate, how to, figure out a solution. Can we, change the rule in this way and that way? And so I think, I feel like schools are probably places where kids actually are more likely to be invited into the opportunity to kind of think. I think what's hard is that when they take that out of the school context into the kind of shadow apparatus, the term that I love, world, then it gets sucked out of them, And so I worry about that mismatch sometimes between what kids might experience within their classrooms, within the opportunities that they're offered as learners, and then what they experience when they age into voting and the more formal political system. But I'm sure you've thought about this a lot more.
Well, I'll just supplement it with another question to you.
Yeah.
As I read your lecture and listened to it again, I was struck by the fact that there are a few places in our society where the story of agencies development that you're telling is, I think, recognized. The military actually being a key one, right? Definitely care about small groups, definitely care about that bridge building work internally and empowering people to answer questions when they have to together. So I was sort of curious what you make about that contrast, and are there lessons to be learned there? And then relatedly, so I'll extend the question, for university campuses. I mean, in principle, we have a great small groups kind of environment, just in the context of teaching in the classroom and so forth. And how should we be thinking about that as an opportunity for supporting the growth of an experience of meaningful commitment to democracy?
Yeah, often when I talk about these kinds of things, and the institutions that people name as being opportunities for people to do this kind of deep work is our faith institutions, which we talked about, obviously, in the military being the second one, and then sometimes higher education, for sure. I think that's absolutely true. Like in the sometimes when I have students from the military in my classes, like part of what I love about it is that, here's a group of people who take things like leadership and organization seriously, right? And they have to think about what it means to bind yourself to another group of people, and then how those commitments shape, what we're willing to do or not do together, and how we negotiate that. So I think that's absolutely right on the military. On college campuses, So, with all the way in which college campuses have been contested, over the past year, I think one of the things that is so interesting is so much of our conversation about higher education focuses on elite campuses like Harvard, like Hopkins, things like that. But really, the vast majority of people go to college campuses, within 100 miles of their home. Like they're going to very different kinds of schools that are often commuter schools or not residential programs. They have a very different kind of college experience. And so I think that there's a huge untapped potential to be able to do a lot of really good work there through community colleges, through regional publics, through a lot of other kind of institutions where that is different than I think what a lot of us who are thinking about this question sometimes imagine. And so we've done some work at the SNF Agora Institute at Hopkins where you're trying to understand how are some of the bigger community colleges thinking about this question of civic education. I think it's a very nascent conversation right now. As you know, for ways in which that conversation has really been taken out of the curricular conversation. But there's a lot of potential, I think, there to still touch on that. The other thing that I'll say is that I've also found interesting some of the data on the ways in which doing things like randomizing people's college roommate choices, also shapes sometimes their public commitments. And so it feels like both in the kind of student affairs side of the work and the kind of curricular side of the work, there's opportunities to think about these questions. So.
Great, thank you. I know there are more questions. Yes. Is it Mira? I don't have my glasses on. Yeah, there we go. Mira.
Great. 2 ed school faculty in a row. This is really nice. This is great. Really, really terrific to hear from both of you. I'm really interested in your emphasis on risk and uncertainty. And I think about the ways in which it feels in many domains of life and institutions, in the workplace, actually in schools, in actually some kinds of interpersonal relationships and so forth, there seems to be an emphasis on actually decreasing risk and increasing standardization and predictability. And I 100% buy your story that risk and unpredictability and risk of failure actually do bring value and fulfillment to our lives, the way that Danielle was also talking about. I remember being totally struck a few years ago, this is entirely anecdotal, but by a story about the ways in which, say, studies of nursing homes and assistive care facilities have benefited by having animals wandering around because they offer unpredictable stimuli, right, that can't be controlled, and actually it seems to have had a whole bunch of beneficial health effects and mental health effects and socialization effects, and that's really stuck with me. The ways in which even small moments of unpredictability can actually change the nature of our lives. But I am curious insofar, in higher education institutions, in our workplaces, in our politics, there is a pretty big push now towards risk reduction and standardization. And so I'm wondering how you think about moving toward the kinds of opportunities that you're talking about for risky, unpredictable collective action, given the institutional moments we're in.
Yeah, so, okay, I totally agree with that. I think, I spend a lot of my time talking to philanthropy or, other people, and I feel like it's so often in that conversation, it's the philanthropist has something they want to do, they want to find someone who can do it, and then they want to script that action, as much as possible. And it's sort of that model of kind of intervention is very much how a lot of our sort of social change apparatus works in a way that I think actually does minimize risk. And so the way I think about it is that the opportunities that we have to act, I think, are both at the micro and the macro level. And so one of the things I didn't talk about is what are all the forces that got us to the point that we're at now? Why is it that we've seen such a sort of shift in the kinds of opportunities that people are offering? And so in order to kind of undo that system, we have to understand the kind of technological and economic and socio-demographic, I think, forces that sort of shaped where we are. But that doesn't mean that we can't change things at the micro level. And so part of the point that I was trying to make is that people are doing things a lot still in their communities, right? But we're not. But the kind of the design characteristics of the kinds of things that we're inviting them into can make a difference in the sort of orientations that they develop. So all of us who are involved in those kinds of opportunities can change that, sooner rather than later. And I think that's where some of the data from like the workplace is really interesting to me. Like just by changing this participatory meeting once a week, they were able to get all these different kind of feelings of empowerment and agency and so on out of their workers. And so there's sort of like design characteristics, I think, that can be shaped at a relatively smaller level. But that's not to replace all the kind of other work that has to be done in thinking about the broader structural forces. And I think, but on the other hand, I don't really know how one changes broader structural forces without getting people involved. And so, part of it is this is a sort of virtuous cycle, I think, that has to feed upon itself.
Professor Gans.
Congratulations, Hahrie, on this terrific stuff. It's really, really helpful. My question is, what motivates people to risk the commitments in the first place? The organizations you've cited are faith-based.
Right.
The military is also, they're values-based organizations. And so I'm curious about the role of values and motivation to risk commitment in the first place.
Yeah, no, I think that's, in some, I remember actually, I think, Danielle, one time we were at a meeting and you made this point that, like, we spend so much of our time, like, stripping the politics out of politics in a way, because politics is really a negotiation of value, right? It's about this question of, like, what it is that we want to optimize, where, like, markets and technology is what we should be using to kind of figure out how to optimize something, but what that is a discussion of values. And there's a way in which, that's been stripped out of a lot of our political life, with the exception of things like the military, faith institutions, places where people enter into them in particular ways. And so I think, obviously, like value, people being able to, having spaces in which they can connect to and negotiate and realize those values is fundamental. And so I think that is important. The one thing I will say, though, is I think what's interesting about like the military and faith institutions is I think that they cultivate those values, and people don't necessarily come in with a realization of them, And so another thing that, and this is a little bit, I think, what I hope to talk about tomorrow, is that it's not just the sort of ways in which they engage risk and the ways in which they sort of bind people to each other, but they also create a space in which that negotiation of values can happen in a way that doesn't happen a lot in our like the Sierra Club or other kinds of organizations like that, which tend to focus more on issues and beliefs than they do on values, and they take that kind of moral component out in a way.
So we've got time for about one last question. I want to make sure a student, if there are any of the hands are student hands that want to jump in and ask a question. Well, there is that. All right, then the hands. I think I saw some hands here. Is that right? Did I? Great.
Well, first of all, down with jackets at recess. It's terrible. I'm totally with your child. And second, I think the question I have is about, when you talk about the supply side lack, that spoke to me so much. And, I work with Marshall, and we have lots of supply that we want to provide. But the Professor Allen, what you said about the shadow apparatus piece, and the sort of, it feels like, look over here, right? Like, look at these things that you should be focused on. I'm wondering, Professor Hahn, what do you think, who's benefiting from that shadow apparatus and from actually responding to the supply side? Like, there are plenty of people who want to respond to that, right? So who's stopping that? Who's benefiting from that gap? So I have a lot of maybe not polite opinions about that, but maybe what I'll say is that I think the people who run our political system, I think, are benefiting from that. And so one of the most striking studies in political science I think that I've read is a study by Jacob Montgomery and Brendan Nyhan, where they were looking at what are the best. They basically did a study. It's an AGPS paper about what are the best predictors of campaign strategy. They looked at congressional campaigns. And you would think that, predictors of campaign strategy would be things like, is it a competitive race? Is it not a competitive race? Is it red state? Is it blue state? Is it, an incumbent? Is it how long has the incumbent been in place? Like all these kind of things. The biggest predictor of campaign strategy was who the consultant is that they hired.
So who is the consultant that which consulting firm did you hire to run your campaign? And so what that tells us is that, now I'm going beyond their paper, but what I took from that is that there's a set of campaign consultants out there, right, who've monetized politics in a way, and they go around and they make all these candidates feel like, you can't run a campaign unless you do all these kind of things. And it is true that, like, if I'm going to go run for office, in order to look legible to the voters, there's a certain set of things. I have to have yard signs, I have to have, ads, I have to, like, do all these things. But the fact that the consultant is outpacing all these political conditions as being a predictor, to me, is an indication of the fact that there's a larger political system in which people are profiting from running, a set of, running politics in a certain way. And so that's part of the cycle that has to be broken.
Terrific. Thank you. Great questions, everybody. So it's time to wrap up for today. Thank you for joining us. The next Tanner Lecture will take place tomorrow at 4 p.m. right back here in Payne Hall. We hope to see you then. Thank you very much for coming.